Hello, Athena. How are you? All right, Athena, I'm going to give you 10 points for showing up and add it to your score on this particular assignment, okay? Um, let's see here. Looking for, I have it open. You see, show all windows maybe. There we go. So hopefully you could see this with me, Athena. So the progressive movement. We're doing the progressive movement, and it really took steam in the 1890s. And let's see here. Hopefully that's not too dark. But it took steam in the 1890s, and it was an intellectual movement for bigger government to tackle what were perceived to be problems of the industrial era. All right. And what were some of the problems that they saw is they were concerned about things like the growing gap between the rich and the poor, class consciousness and class friction. They were concerned about hopelessness amongst the poor, selfishness and greed amongst the rich, immorality amongst all socioeconomic realms, the disintegration of the family. Those are some of the main, concerns that progressives had. Hillary Clinton, when she ran for president, described herself as a progressive. This is very relevant to this day, the progressive kind of paradigm, the way they looked at things and changed things. So if you want to look at some of the intellectual forebears of it, you have a list here: Washington Gladden, Richard T. Ely, Henry Carter Adams, Edmund James, Edward Ross, J. Allen Smith, John Bates Clark. Gladden, look what it's Washington Gladden wrote: "To live is not to separate ourselves from our fellows, but to unite with them in multiform ministries of giving and receiving. We are parts of a whole." They were above, so they were for civic virtue. And when I think of civic virtue, I think of like Tacitus and Cicero back in Rome. You put aside your class, selfish class interest for what's best for the whole country. All right. And so that's what they were concerned with, was selfishness, basically, excessive individualism amongst people of all classes. So the working class, right? They didn't like how militant the working class was becoming. They didn't like the fact that a lot of times they were, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get into this. They were above crass materialism, the consumer-oriented culture, and they were for association. And to them, association was limited cooperation amongst the classes. They were afraid of a class war between the rich and the poor, between the laborers and the capitalists. And they literally thought they were going to get caught in the middle of it. Because remember, a lot of the progressives were middle class, old middle class. So like the intelligentsia, those who owed their careers to their college education and their access to things of academia. So lawyers, pastors and priests, judges, writers, teachers, etc. So at any rate, that's something we're going to get back to as far as the demographic of the progressives themselves. But in court history, right? Court history is going to praise them. It's going to call them altruistic do-gooders, right? And altruism, you put the needs of others above yourself. And you'll see some evidence for that soon. So look what they were concerned about also. I mean, you see here, 1905, the wealthiest 1% controlled 88% of the country's assets, over one third of its capital, and over a quarter of its factory laborers, just the wealthiest 1%. And from 1897 to 1904, about a third of all companies were merged. And oftentimes, right, that was kind of against their will. And so consolidation scared them as more and more industries were coming under the grasp of just a few titans. And they saw that that is inherently unfair, right? And so like the analogy of sports, right? Like I think of like baseball, where they don't have a salary cap. I don't believe they do. I don't watch baseball, but I think they don't. And I apologize if I'm wrong, but let's say they don't still. And so teams like the Yankees could just out purchase everyone else. They could purchase the best players and offer them the highest salaries, and they keep winning and keep winning. And to them, right, they contend, hey, that's fair. It's a capitalist game in a capitalist society, and we that's just the way it goes, right? We earned it. We earned that extra money, and to be able to spend, and we have the right to do so. And I'm likening that to the robber barons, right? And then the other people, they would contend, no, we need something more like the NFL. The NFL, right? They have a salary cap. Everyone only has so much money they could spend on wages to their players. So it puts people on more of an equal playing field. And then also, right, and I know in the NFL, the last place team who does the most poorly in 16 games gets the first pick draft the next year to try to even things up and balance things and secure a sense of parity in the league. Our capital system was not like that. Our capital system was like the New York Yankees, buying all the most expensive players and winning the World Series year after year. And so, people were frustrated with that, with the robber barons and their success. And they felt like there was just something inherently unfair of them continually, quote, winning. So what do they want to do? They wanted to break up trusts. We talked about trusts, right? When leading corporations were engaging in price conspiracies, putting their sources together and resources together, joining governing boards, but they were staying as separate entities on the stock market. And so they were teaming up, and it just something seemed inherently unfair about that. And so you have that, especially with Rockefeller. And so they began breaking up the trust according to the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was very vague, right? That there would be no conspiracies or just budding together in restraint of trade and competition. And so Teddy Roosevelt proclaimed himself to be a progressive as our president. Before that, at least as early as being the governor of New York. And so he wanted to enforce the Sherman Act and began breaking up some trusts. And they broke up Standard Oil Trust of Rockefellers. And so at any rate, after him, William Howard Taft's administration broke up the most trusts. And Wilson's administration, after Taft's, in the 19-teens, instituted the Clayton Act. His Congress did. And the Clayton Antitrust Act is what we follow today because it's specified. It gives exact examples of violation of the Antitrust Act. And so that now it puts some teeth into the Sherman Act so that it could be more enforceable, for lack of a better adjective. So then union recognition and collective bargaining, Teddy Roosevelt, right? He gave a, quote, square deal to the United Mine Workers Association. There was a guy named George Bayer, and George Bayer was refusing to meet with the union. They were demanding a tax increase, an 8-hour workday, and collective bargaining rights. And he arrogantly said no, that it was up to him, that it was his prerogative to pay his workers whatever he wanted. And if they wanted to strike, fine, he would hire scab workers in their place. And so there was a lot of petitioning for the president to intervene, and he did. He even threatened to take over Bayer's coal, his hard coal, and distribute it to the poor for free if he didn't come to the bargaining table with the union. So he did with the president's coercion, and the workers didn't get exactly as high of a wage as they had hoped for. They didn't get everything that they wanted, but they got some. And so Teddy Roosevelt, in a very paternalistic way, like he were the father figure between the capitalists and their laborers, said that he gave each side a square deal. Teddy Roosevelt was fascinating as a progressive, because you see an ideological side and you see a pragmatic side as well. The ideological side, you see writings that he had written to his sister. He called her Bammy, to his sister Bammy, from the time he was young, at least as young as college years, going to Harvard. And you see evidence that he felt a sense of noblesse oblige as someone born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He felt like, because God had blessed him into being born into a wealthy family, that it was the job of the wealthy to pay it forward for God and and for society, and to help those who couldn't help themselves. And that's what the progressives claim to have stood for, right? Was to help out the marginalized, help out the frustrated, help out the working class. And so at any rate, Teddy Roosevelt contended that he was going to be like a knight, a chivalric knight, and he was going to help the less fortunate. And so he's going to embrace some progressive platforms, like he became famous for jumping on to Jacob Riis's, as you read in #1, Jacob Riis, his crusade to have health and sanitation standards in housing, especially for the poor at the 5 Points in New York City. And of course, the buildings and so forth were extremely dangerous and unsanitary and just horrific. The conditions were just horrific for the immigrants that were living there. So Teddy Roosevelt insisted to his legislator that something be done at the state level of New York to implement safety and sanitation standards that had to be met by the builders, the contractors, etc., who are building these buildings, and the homeowners, the property owners. And he also jumped on to the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the FDA to the expression, you don't want to know how the sausage is made. Upton Sinclair, in his famous Muckraker book, pretty much exposed how awful the working conditions were and the sanitation conditions were in the meat packing industry. And so he wanted standards to be met for safety for consumers as they bought and consumed and ate the meat that was made in those factories. And so those were a couple of the famous cases. He also was a preservationist and a conservationist. Preservationist hold certain natural habitats under the state or federal level for in perpetuity, for as long as possible, forever. To the idea was he had a friend named Pinchot, and they were both well-to-do, and they had the means, the money, and the time to go on trips and to go hiking and to see these beautiful places like Yosemite and Yellowstone. And so at any rate, he thought that it was unfair that the wealthy could just buy that land and fence it off from the rest of the public. He wanted the rest of the people to be able to enjoy it themselves, right? And so those were some examples of him being a progressive. I think he was also for graduated income taxes. So the more you make, the higher percentage of tax of your income is taxed. To conservatives, that's punishing the rich for their success. But Teddy Roosevelt was progressive in his platform in many ways, for collective bargaining rights of labor unions, etc. However, he had a pragmatic side as well. There was a Bradley Martin party in New York. It was $116 a plate, and it was a costume party. And it was the midst of the 1893 Depression, and people were starving in New York, and they were having this well-to-do party, and he was furious. because he thought that that type of ostentation by the rich was going to bring about like a French Revolution, where the poor were just going to not abide by the dichotomy of their suffering and the rich just having this frivolous lifestyle. And so he told them basically, you idiots, don't you know you're going to get the rest of us rich people in trouble with the poor by showing off your wealth as such? And so there was more of a practical, pragmatic side to his progressivism, in which he was scared of a class war and he wanted to give hope, and not just hope, right? But he also wanted to give catharsis to the poor. And what do I mean by catharsis, right? Like punching a punching bag. Is he wanted to give the poor a sense of satisfaction with their anger and seeing the rich being put in their place, so that it would displace their anger, it would mitigate their anger, and they'd be less inclined to rise in rebellion. Because he hated things that were tied to Marxism. He hated communism and socialism. He didn't even approve of gas and water socialism. And gas and water socialism is when, yeah, I call it diet socialism, when you believe that most commodities and services still ought to be left up to the capitalist system. So hence just free enterprise and free interchange. So hence, if you don't have enough money to buy a yacht, then it stinks for you, but oh well. Not everyone is going to be able to buy a yacht. But access to medical care, access to electricity and water, access to public transportation, that those such things ought to be entitled, set aside as a right that all Americans are entitled to. And hence they ought to be subsidized by the government, help to be paid for by the government, so that they're made affordable and available to the common poor person. And so he wasn't even a gas and water socialist. So he wasn't very far to the left in wanting radical change. He was somewhat, I would subjectively say, um, a conservative progressive. And so you have that progressive side, or that conservative side to him. J.P. Morgan approached him, supposedly, according to Howard Zinn's book, and stated, so I see that you broke up Rockefeller's trust. Is this what I'm to expect of my trust as well? And Teddy Roosevelt supposedly privately assured him, don't worry, I'm not that radical. I'm not going to break up all the trusts. The public needed to see Rockefeller punished, again, to kind of give them catharsis, to vent their anger, so that they'd be less inclined to rebel. And so he says, as long as you're a good trust and you provide a lot of jobs for a lot of people and you pay your workers reasonably, you give reasonable prices for your products, he said, my administration will leave you alone. So he wasn't that radical. When I think of more radical progressives, I think of like, oftentimes it was at the state and local level, like at the state level with Fighting Bob La Follette. La Follette was, at least at one time, a gas and water socialist. He was for, mandating a minimum wage, maximum work hours for workers, and much more regulation over the capitalists and their conditions that they afforded their workers. And like I said, Hazen Pingree, the mayor of Detroit, those guilty of white collar crimes, he confiscated, had their property confiscated, and gave it out to the homeless. And so there were more radical ideas out there. A guy named Hiram Johnson here in California, much more radical ideas that flirted with the ideas of like wealth redistribution, of finding ways of taking more money from the rich and giving it to the poor. All right. And so you have all that going on. So they wanted to sublimate, give catharsis for working class animosity, and give the working class hope, so that they'd be less inclined to rebel also. So in Chicago in the 1880s, you had a lot of strife. You had the Pullman strike in 1894. Also, they were concerned that the working class were going to stay in the spot they were in, not only because of the greed of their employers, but because of the working class's behavior themselves, that they were either getting into trouble and getting involved in criminal activity, et cetera. You know, the Italians got a bad name, et cetera, or that they were wasting their discretionary income on consumerism and amusements, and for a sense of an escape, right? Because this is the heyday of amusements and the beginning of a leisure 5-day work week with a weekend. And so people were going to amusement parks, Nickelodeons to watch movies, and in unprecedented numbers. And they wanted them to save their money and give them hope that they could rise from their status, right? So they wanted consumer protection laws, like I mentioned, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Food and Drug Administration, to protect consumers, right? Again, oftentimes contending that they were for the underdog and for the average person. In this case, the average person that was buying a product. So whether it be meat, canned meat that people were eating, or, you know, later on, I think of cases like lead in the paint of toys, and little babies or toddlers chew on those toys and get lead poisoning, you know, something of that sort. They felt that the employers on their own did not have the moral scruples to stop such practices because of pure greed, stopping the process, implementing health and safety standards in their factories would in the short run cost them money, so they wouldn't want to do it. So hence the government needs to force that upon them. And then urban malaise, right? They were worried that the people in the big cities, especially the working class and the poor, were losing their moral compass and losing their sense of purpose in the world. That type of disorientation you feel when you are taught certain normative values, a certain worldview, an explanation for the world and what's wrong with it and what ought to be done with it, et cetera. And then you move into a radically different environment and everything becomes disoriented. What you were taught doesn't seem to fit the realities that you're experiencing. And you feel a sense of normlessness where you just don't know anymore what your purpose is. And so the progressives tried to settle that. So most famously, I think of the settlement houses, Jane Addams, Lillian Wald, these nurses and other reforming middle-class women would establish these homes, if you will, that provided free of charge daycare for the children, a place for them to stay and to become educated and learn and to develop skills. Even recreational sports was thought to be a way to keep the kids off the streets. Because at this time, right, the progressives were almost deists, I would say, subjectively. Remember deism from the Enlightenment in the 1740s, where you think that there are natural laws that operate in every realm of the world. And so hence there are natural laws to humans, individuals, and their interaction with their own society, hence sociology. Sociology became a new social science and really, in some ways, almost began to usurp the authority and the prestige of the churches that the pastors and priests had once enjoyed. And so people were looking to these big shot sociologists, you know, Emile Durkheim and the Chicago School of Sociologists to provide them answers as to why people do what they do in society. And so they wanted to apply those sociological theories and laws to policies that would better create a healthy environment for the Americans as a whole. And so to them, right, crime was oftentimes a byproduct of your environment. You see here, I see that the individual criminal is not always wholly to blame, that many crimes grow directly out of the sins and injustices of his or her society, fighting Bob La Follette. So they were for being more lenient on poor immigrants and children for their crimes, because they believed that sociologically they were in an environment that was more conducive to criminal activity. So let's say, your proverbial high school, where it's taught to be a counterculture. You're taught to, in order to enjoy the approval of your adolescent peers, it's actually cooler for you to defy your teacher, to defy your administrators. If you're a poor immigrant family, there's a sense of being alienated and marginalized by American society. And so hence your family and others teach you that you ought to stick it to the man, stick it to the institution. And so hence criminal activity is not frowned upon, but is actually even almost encouraged. So with the role of sociology and mass psychology that the progressives embraced, they were big, on, nature versus nurture argument of what really forms us. They were huge on nurture. They were huge on people are molded by their environment. So they thought by changing the environment of the poor, it would give them hope. It would give them direction, keep them off the streets, etc. All right. They wanted to restrain moral decadence. Divorce had gone up by 4 times. Alcoholic consumption had doubled. And so they engaged in crusades against alcohol, against prostitution, against premarital sex, against immoral activities like some of the vaudeville shows and the X-rated dancing and so forth. So they really were not afraid to tackle the social realm. And now, yes, some of the progressives, as well-to-do middle-class people, had just come from the Victorian era. And remember, with the Victorian era, it was all about propriety and proper etiquette, and mainly following Judeo-Christian norms, right? Like from the Bible, particularly about sexuality. But also there was more of a secular bent to it as well, is that these, quote, sins had a dysfunctional function with our institutions, especially with our institution of the family, of the nuclear family of mom, dad, and the kids. And so they were concerned about that, about the breakup of families. Again, they were also concerned about rugged individualism becoming excessive. The kids, for the first time in the middle class societies, their families were moving to the suburbs. Suburbs were kind of a new phenomenon, and they were getting their own bedrooms, their own study. They were getting private tutors, etc. The mothers in the middle class were expected not to work, according to old school norms of separate spheres, of women being in the private home sphere and the men being in the public sphere. But yet with a dishwasher, laundromats, bakeries, canned food, and all these inventions, they had more time on their hands at home, arguably. And so hence you have a lot of middle-class women wanting a sense of purpose, wanting a crusade to follow, etc. So hence you had a disproportionate number of middle-class women who became progressive reformers and wanting to bring about some changes. And I think numerically, with alcohol, is the women's Christian temperance movement. This numerically was the largest organization in the country that consisted primarily of women, or consisted of women. And they were for alcohol. They technically, right, temperance is moderation, but they're pretty much for abstemious behavior, just absolutely going away from alcohol consumption. So you have, and also the Anti-Saloon League. Look up a woman named Carrie Nation. very interesting woman who became a symbol, a militant symbol amongst women for fighting against alcohol. She went into Kansas and went into bars and with literally with a hatchet and would begin attacking the alcohol itself, the containers of alcohol, reading scripture and citing scripture as she was doing so. She was arrested for public mischief and destruction of property, and she became a celebrity in when that happened. And so again, you have this all this going on. And then not to mention, I'm going to get more onto it when I do Woodrow Wilson, but you also had the women's suffrage movement. So women were very, very pivotal in the progressive movement, right? Remember, suffrage is the level of citizenship, oftentimes in history, the ultimate highest level of citizenship that is participatory, that you could vote and run for office. So at this time, you had Victoria Woodhull. A lot of people took it as a joke, but Victoria Woodhull ran for president. All right. So what I want to do is I want to stop sharing this and I want to go straight to the document itself, your argumentative assignment, if that's all right with you. Here it is. All right. So with number one, expect to find court history. If someone told me, right, Mr. Cowell, Derek, I want you to adhere to court history on the progressive movement. Try to select facts, interpret those facts, and present them in such a way that makes the progressives look like altruistic crusaders. I'd say, okay, I would probably do somewhat roughly the following that you see here on number one. I would mention Jane Addams and Lillian Wald in the Settlement House Project. A lot of time, resources, dedicated, sacrificed to help the less fortunate in those settlement house programs. You'd go there, right? And they'd give you an aptitude test and they would try to, for the kids, they would bathe them, clean them, feed them, provide them activities free of charge. And with the adults, they would give an aptitude test to you and try to help you decide what your skill set was. And then they would work with the beginnings of employment agencies to try to directly find you a job. Jane Addams learned the languages of some of the Central European immigrants in Chicago area. I don't know if it was just German or Polish, but at any rate, she celebrated their holidays, etc. All right. So you have that. Then you have Jacob Riis. I'd mention him, and I'd also mention the muckrakers. So Jacob Riis, right? He wanted to pay it forward. A Danish immigrant who had fallen through the cracks, so to speak, and was given a chance by progressive reformers, became a journalist. And then when he came across the 5 points and how awful the living conditions were therein, he devised a work of pictures as well as writing that was entitled How the Other Half Lives. It was meant to shame the rest of the country, to show just how awful conditions were for the poor immigrants there. You see the picture of those children sleeping on the streets. And I don't know myself to what extent those photos were staged or improvisational, but they were pretty effective. So that's Jane Addams, Lillian Wald, and Jacob Riis. You see their pictures at the bottom, some settlement house pictures as well. And then you had the muckrakers, and they were journalists who deliberately raked up the muck, right? They deliberately exposed the ugly underside of institutions, practices, etc., found in society. And of course, to what end, right? To the end of trying to provoke enough public indignation, enough public righteous anger for the people, the public itself, to demand a change in those circumstances. So I mentioned Upton Sinclair in the meat packing industry. Let's see here. I have other examples. Shame on me for not remembering off memory. Ida B. Tarbell, the robber barons, Lincoln Steffens, urban political corruption, Donaldina Cameron, problems with the prostitution here in California. All right, and then I have McGair's work, and McGair, he's revisionist. All right, this is revisionist history. He's going to say, you know what? I don't think it was just out of the goodness of their heart the progressives did what they did. I think they did it because they were afraid of getting literally caught in the middle of a class war. And I think also because of envy or jealousy of big business. Because remember, most of the progressives were petty or small scale middle class. And yeah, so at any rate, it's a famous thesis by Richard Hofstadter, and he contends, right, that the people are the progressives were bitter because the robber barons were eclipsing them in status and societal positions and opportunities and wealth. And some of them, especially the lawyers, were becoming to feel enslaved by big business, because the best, most lucrative jobs as a lawyer, to be paid the best, were to work as a hired gun for a corporation. So hence there was a sense of resentment, right, against big business. So hence they wanted to break up the trusts, right? They wanted regulatory legislation demanding what they could and couldn't offer their workers in wages and conditions, etc. They wanted graduated income taxes. The more you make, the higher income tax you pay, kind of almost punishing the rich. So was there an element of sour grapes, if you will, amongst the progressives against big business? And what do you know, right? They wanted professionals in charge of government, in charge of the main institutions of the country. And who were the professionals? Themselves, people from their own intelligentsia, their own class, right? College educated middle class people. So how convenient for them. They wanted bar exams and law school for lawyers, as we're accustomed to now, but was not the case up until this time. You could simply just apprentice yourself to a lawyer and eventually become recognized as such without passing the bar. Same thing with a medical degree. But to some historians, right, they think, yeah, of course, they wanted to limit how many people can join their ranks by making it more difficult. So something to think about. Then with number 3, this is the conservative argument against progressivism. Says basically, right, that the founding fathers wanted everyone to earn his or her way. Meritocracy. You get what you pay for. But the progressives pretty much stated that some of them were gas and water socialists, some were downright socialists, and some wanted to balance socialism with capitalism. So by their own admission, they were embracing to limited degrees Marxist thought by Karl Marx. And remember, to Karl Marx and its derivations of socialism and communism and syndicalism and all those isms, right, is it's according to need, not merit. That you ought to get things according to how badly you need them, right? So the poor getting welfare checks, getting unemployment checks, having access to free gas and water and public transportation, right? All those things are not earned, and the progressives know that. And so again, today, Hillary Clinton and many Democrats say that they are progressives. So it's super relevant to today, whereby to this very day, you have more kind of libertarian. Remember, libertarian is government, stay out of my business, let me do my thing. You have libertarian conservatives to this day saying that the Democratic Party is too socialistic, that they want to give according to need instead of according to merit, and that's not what the founding fathers wanted. They were for things going by merit, that everyone earn his or her own way. How are you doing, Chrissy? Good. All right, good. All right, and then number 4 is a counter rebuttal to that argument. What progressives say. And they say basically that some people that are poor are caught in a cycle that they can't free themselves from, and they need that extra government help. So I liken it, right, to like a 100-meter dash. And some people like Teddy Roosevelt were born at the 90-meter mark, right, or 99th meter mark. They were pretty much born at the finish line with all that wealth. They just take a couple steps themselves for the American dream. Some people, arguably, were born behind the starting line. And then some people, right, with certain obstacles to overcome, it's as if they're having to carry a backpack filled with rocks in it as they try to run the race and have hurdles in front of them that other people don't have. So that hence the race isn't fair. And so that the government ought to come in and help relieve those people by removing the hurdles that are on the track, taking the backpack off of them filled with rocks to give them a fair chance at the American dream. That's what the liberal progressive rebuttal is. And you find that here in number 4. So for instance, at this time, right, you're a child, your dad makes $360 a year, but according to Alan Brinkley in the textbook, it costs $600 a year a person just to live. And he's got a family to support. So you're an 8-year-old girl, and they say, sorry, honey, you can't go to school anymore. We need you to work in a mine or in a factory. And so you can't even go to school because you have to help feed your family. Progressives wanted to do something about that. They wanted to provide minimum wage laws so that dad could make more money to support his family and his kids could go to public school and have a shot at a future. One area, one obstacle that I think was an omission or a weakness of the progressives, or even a failure, was the quote color line. What W.E.B. Du Bois called the color line is they didn't, and I go back and forth from what I read as far as being racist themselves, being indifferent themselves, having what they determine to be a full plate already and just not have much extra room for that battle, if you will, or just cowardice. and not having the political courage to take on, the aftermath, the racist reaction to taking on that crusade. But whatever the reason was, the progressives were very weak on helping racism as an obstacle. They were good with economic obstacles, but not ethnic ones, not racist ones. All right. So Chrissy, I'm for sure going to give you 10 points for sticking around. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Professor, for making time to lecture.
No problem. No problem at all. But yeah, I mean, so really that's about it. Do you have any questions or anything?
I don't have anything that I can think of at this very moment.
Okay. All right.
But thank you.
You're welcome. All right, Chrissy, well, you have a good day, okay? Thank you. And I'm happy to give you your 10 extra credit points. You've earned them. Bye-bye.